All right, we are recording.
Okay.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Candace Dobie, speaker, author, and coach dedicated to helping young leaders build up courage in themselves. And today I am excited to be joined by Clemson University professor of psychology, Dr. Cynthia Pury. Welcome.
Hello.
Thank you for being here. I'm
Of
excited
course.
to have a conversation with you about courage.
Okay.
And Dr. Pury, you have been studying courage for a while. You've written books
Yes.
on courage.
Mhm.
And let me just say, I've read Psychology of Courage from cover to cover. Yes, you've written articles, you've taught classes at Clemson on courage, and so I want to start out by
Yes.
asking you, how did courage become one of your research interests?
Well, I went to graduate school and studied fear and cognition, and that was kind of the big thing that I was working on. I trained as a clinician, and I was doing research on how people process information when they are afraid. The short story is when people are afraid, they hone in on whatever the risky thing is, and they overestimate risk.
Mm,
And I'm sort of more of a big picture person, and by the time I got to this area of research, most of the research that was out there was eh, getting very fine-grained level of detail.
mm,
And that's just not me. And I was honestly getting a little kind of bored with it.
mm,
And another article would come out and I'd think, oh no, rather than yay, something interesting new to read. And so
mm.
um, I was in a tenure track position. And so I just persisted with it because I had to, because it would have been too late to switch. And then the year that I got tenure, I was asked to do a seminar on fear and horror. And I thought, cool. And then I went, well, that's kind of depressing. So, what can we do to mitigate these things? And so, at the end of the class, I wanted to have them do readings on how to get over a phobic fear or an excessive fear or an unrealistic fear. There's
Mm,
excellent technology for that. I mean, there's thousands of articles on that.
mm,
And then what can you do if it's a realistic fear? Well, you can make the situation less risky. And so that's risk management, and that's risk. That's all sorts of things about safety. And there's a whole lot of research on that also. And then what can you do if it's a realistic threat, but you can't do anything about it? And that's where courage comes in. And then I went to look up the research on that, and I found that it like fit into my handbag.
mm.
It was
Good
like
way to put it.
just a few, I mean, it literally, it fit into the bag that I was schlepping back and forth with me to the office. And I went, well, that's not very much at all. And so
Mm.
this was a distinction between me as an instructor who was like, oh no, there's no research, and me as a researcher who was like, wow, what a cool area. And so I've
Yeah.
been doing research in that area ever since.
Wow. I
So
love
so
how you,
honestly, that's how I got interested in it. It was
yeah.
just, it was an opportunity I saw, it was a hole that I saw in our full picture of how people deal with risk.
I love that. Now, I want to ask you because courage, like you've mentioned, there's been a
Mhm,
lot of research done about courage and people take
mhm,
their different, angle and perspective on it.
mhm.
And so one of the things that I came across just as I was doing research is that, it has been the topic of conversation
Mhm.
among politicians and philosophers and lay people
Yes.
for thousands of years.
Mhm,
And what I learned is that I believe Aristotle, all the way from
mhm,
Aristotle to like Maya Angelou, really
mhm,
consider courage to be the first or the most important human virtue.
mhm.
And I'd love to get your thoughts on what you think about that. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I think after being in positive psychology in general for the last decade ish or more,
Hmm.
um, I really think that whatever virtue is needed at
Mm,
the time is going to be the most important virtue. And so, in a situation where people are having to make decisions incredibly quickly with limited information, and and there's a giant pressure on people to do things really fast, wisdom's going to
Mhm.
be the most important.
I
And
see.
when people are being super selfish, kindness is going to be the most important. I mean, so I think it's going to really depend on the situation. And I think what courage has going for it that makes it probably more likely to be called universal more times
Mhm.
is that risk is the risk can be kind of generic. So you can mold courage to say, well, someone needs to be courageous to be kind in an unkind environment. Someone needs to be courageous to be wise in a hurried environment. But that doesn't mean that uh, courage itself is the most important virtue. It is an intermediary virtue that helps you
Mm.
do other worthwhile things.
Yes. And I think I've heard that too, is that courage can be foundational to really
Yes.
helping
Yeah.
you,
Yeah. But
exercise or do some of those other things. It could be
right.
like you said, be kind when it's really hard, when you're in a
Mhm,
situation where it's really
mhm,
hard to
mhm.
be kind.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I
Uh,
want to ask you this because
sure.
this is a question that I have kind of mulled over and I'd love to get your perspective. But
Uh-huh.
I have recognized that we kind of interchange words like courage and bravery and
Mhm,
fearlessness.
mhm,
These kind of
mhm.
all get mixed together.
Yes.
And I want to hear what you think about how these words are different. Like, how would you say courage and bravery are different?
They might be different, they might not be different. It sort of depends on how people want to define them. So in psychology in general, I mean, and in science in general, there's the sort of expert term, or there's the research term that all the researchers agree on, and that definition, which with courage we're still arguing about that. But there's that term, and then there's how people use it in their everyday life. And it's hard to know which one to go with. Now, fearless is so courage and brave, I think, could be used interchangeably potentially or not. It
Okay.
depends on the circumstance. I certainly know that within the research literature, mostly we talk about courage.
Mhm.
Even though bravery is in the VIA, I think we mostly, the courage researchers I know, well, I guess they're courage researchers, but they mostly hone in on the courage part.
Yeah.
Um, and within VIA, courage and bravery are definitely distinguished by courage is the overarching virtue, and bravery
Mm.
is the human strength that lets you persist despite difficulty, I believe is their definition, or it's something
Okay.
close to that. Um, I yeah, and I'm lukewarm on that, or agnostic on that. Fearlessness, though, is super interesting because when I started in this area, the most prominent model of courage, and it's still a really prominent model of courage, is Jack Rackman's definition of courage as being it's based on the tripartite model of emotion. So somebody has, if you have an emotional response, you have your internal subjective state, you have your physiological response, and then you have your action tendency, or what you feel like doing. And for
Okay.
him, courage is having this subjective and or physiological response of fear, but acting in a way that contradicts it. And so according to his definition, fearless depends on what you're talking about. The action is fearless, but the person is fearful.
Ah, that's
Um,
interesting.
in the way that our research portrays courage, courage is, in fact, we take the fear out of it because our subjects, our participants in our research studies, have told us sometimes that they've described something they did that was really courageous, and they described feeling very little fear. It For whatever reason, very frequently because it was something that required immediate action and they didn't think about it very much. Sometimes they also describe something that requires that actually they were feeling a lot of fear, but their fear was more a fear that they weren't going to succeed in trying to do whatever they were going to do. So, like, if someone tries to save a family member from, a terrible accident, you're going to be way more afraid of what's going to happen to your uncle or to your daughter or whoever than you are afraid for yourself. So they describe a lot of fear, but it's not the kind of fear that we think about when we think about courage. And so to me, it has always made more sense to take the fear out of it and talk about what is it that leads to fear in the first place. It's a sense of risk. So you know that it's risky. And Chris Rate's research on courage definitely shows that the risk is a better way to think about it. And so fearless is a very challenging sort of definition. And fearless also, like, I don't know, I'm not as fond of fearless in a way because it connotes that you're not afraid of anything,
Right.
which isn't a safe way to live life or a good or wise way to live life, and is not a virtue in those senses. If you're absolutely fearless, you'll just walk out in traffic, and that's not helpful.
So
Yeah.
how do you yeah, I agree with you. And I think, this kind of blends into my next question pretty
Mhm.
beautifully, but I feel like fearlessness, just the word,
Yeah.
fearless and fearlessness, it's kind
Mhm.
of become pretty common in popular culture.
Yes.
People want to be fearless, and you can add a little snap on the end of that, but
Yep.
it is really hard to achieve. And like you said, it's not necessarily something that I think we want to achieve.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like, how
Well,
do you think? Oh, go ahead, go for it.
I was just going to say, I mean, that kind of makes me think that, like, it would be good to be fearless in pursuit of your goals,
Mm,
and in pursuit of something that's super noble in some particular way. So, uh, if I hire a lawyer, I would like it if my lawyer was fearless in her defense of me. That certainly seems like a real good thing. So but it has that particular context to it, and the
yeah.
context is going to be related to whatever the goal the person is pursuing.
So really, all of this depends on context, or it depends
Yeah.
on the particular goal that we're after.
Yes,
And
very
so
much, very
it
much.
sounds like what you're saying is, for courage, risk
Uh-huh.
is at the center of courage.
Hmm.
For an
Hmm.
act to be courageous, or for someone to act courageously, you
Hmm.
absolutely need fear. Or excuse me,
Risk.
absolutely need risk.
Yes, yes, yes.
But you don't necessarily need fear, or fear doesn't have to, be involved in that equation.
Right. That seems to be what our research is saying. And again, this research is like how people are using this word. Is there some psychological construct out there about standing up to fear in particular? I would say
Mhm.
yes, and there are scales out there that measure that.
Yeah.
But it's a different kind of thing, and it's at least not how people seem to be using the word courage, at least within the English language.
So if a person has a goal, let's
Uh-huh.
say, we can pick a goal. I talk to a lot of young leaders, so
Uh-huh.
we'll pick a professional one.
Uh-huh.
A person wants to speak up in a meeting.
Uh-huh.
There's a lot of fear around that. The
Yep.
risk is rejection,
Mhm,
embarrassment, humiliation.
mhm,
What does a person really need to go through to be able to take the risk and
mhm.
to kind of choose courage? What would you say?
I think it's going to, in large part, depend on what the goal of speaking up in the meeting is. So, it's the action, in a sense, is speaking up in a meeting. But are you speaking up in a meeting to uh, complain that Jennifer took the last donut? I mean, that's just stupid, right? Or are you speaking up in the meeting to save your organization from making a horrible mistake that will run it into the ground? Or
Mm,
are you speaking up in the meeting because you have good ideas and they've not been listened to, and you're kind of tired of it, and you have to do this or you won't advance in your career?
mhm.
And those are all different sorts of things. The last two are really worthwhile kind of goals that I can easily see people motivating themselves for.
Yeah.
And the other one is not. Um, and also, it's going to depend on how much the individual is has social anxiety about speaking up, or has more specifically like public speaking anxiety, or more specifically has a particular concern with a particular individual at the meeting, versus doesn't care about those things.
Mhm.
And that's going to affect her or his sense of personal risk in that situation too. Um,
So
yeah.
if a person has decided that the risk is worthwhile, they're
Hmm.
doing it because their views have not been heard, or they
Uh-huh.
feel like they
Uh-huh.
have something that's very valuable to
Uh-huh.
contribute that would help
Uh-huh.
the organization.
Uh-huh.
Um, but there has been a history of kind of being dismissed, and
Hmm.
they don't want to go through that humiliation, but they know that it's worthwhile. They know
Hmm.
that the reason is worthwhile.
Hmm.
What would they need to work through to be able to get to the point where they can speak up?
Well, I think it would be a good realistic assessment of what the actual risk is. Is the
Mm,
risk just that you're going to feel icky,
yeah.
or is the risk that you're going to be fired?
Mm,
And those are incredibly different in terms of their outcome and their impact on your life. And so
yeah.
if the risk is something like, you know, I'm, and if I say that, then people look at me and I'm going to feel really awkward. But I know that I've had really good performance reviews for the past 5 years, and I'm part of this leadership program, and I guess I should start acting like it. Like, that's really different
Yeah.
than, well, I've seen the management style of these folks, and the last 4 people who have spoken up at meetings like this have all been fired. Then that is a very different sort of situation that a person's in. And to make a good decision about that, um, it may very well be like, this is an intolerable state and I can't be here anymore. And we see that with like whistleblowers and other people who speak up within organizations where their voice is not valued.
Yeah.
um, and that's a legitimate question that people can ask themselves. Is this
Yeah.
worth it?
And I think that's just it. I mean, like you said, evaluation
Mhm.
of the risk, but really
Mhm.
getting down to what is the worthwhile purpose? Like you said,
Right.
what is
Right.
this really for? What am I doing this for? And
Right.
whatever the case
Exactly.
may be, if I can't, if it may result in me losing my job,
Mhm.
is this worthwhile purpose worthwhile
Right.
enough? Yeah.
Right, right. And risking losing your job, that's also going to depend on your personal circumstances. Do you have the personal and household financial resources to make that worthwhile? What's the economy like right now? What's the demand for people in my field right now? Am I close
Yeah.
to retirement? And I've actually seen this a few times myself with people that I know who, when they're very close to retirement, they speak up a lot more because they're like, what do I have to lose?
Yeah. The risk gets
I'm
lower. It's not as high
yeah,
stakes.
like this is my last year here, so I'm just going to tell you what I think. And I have definitely seen that.
Yeah. Do you think that courage is one of those things that we can practice and get better at? Or is this something that doesn't get better with practice?
I think it's just so complicated that to practice it to get better in general is going to be really hard,
Mm,
because everybody has different things that they feel are particularly risky for them. So I personally, I have no fear of public speaking. I love public speaking. It's one of my very favorite things. I routinely teach classes of hundreds of people, and that's been one of the bad things about the pandemic for me, is like I don't get to see hundreds of students laugh at my jokes, and that makes me sad. And it's, you tell me I have to give a speech tomorrow to 400 people and we're all socially distanced, I'd be like, well, okay, I guess that'd be fine. But if you tell me I need to get up on a ladder to change the light bulb that's over the speaker podium, like, I'm not doing that because I'm afraid of heights. And if you flip that to somebody who's afraid of public speaking, but who doesn't mind heights at all, and in fact is an avid rock climber, you ask that person to go change the light bulb, and they're like, of course, but don't make me talk. And
right.
so you can look to see what kinds of oversensitivity to risks you might have in your life and practice those. And that's really no different than any kind of approach, any kind of, get over your irrational fear sort of approaches. Um, and in some cases, I'm clumsy, heights are bad for me. She said, like someone with a phobia,
Yeah.
but it's, there's good technology for that, and that's really just meant to reduce your sense of risk in that particular situation. But also you can commit to goals, and you can think through how you're going to achieve that particular goal and how you can maybe do so in a less risky way.
Yeah.
And that's certainly been a thing with this pandemic, is that technology allows us so many lower risk ways of doing things, like this interview, for example.
Hmm.
We have a lot of technology that I think make things that might have been required courage in the past in order to accomplish. We actually have the technology now to accomplish them in a lower risk way. Are
Yeah.
they as meaningful? Are they as valuable? That's like a question, but that's this is just like an example of things. So the person
Yeah.
speaking up at the meeting, are there better and worse ways to bring up, hey, that's a terrible idea and we shouldn't be doing it? Yes, there are absolutely better and worse ways to bring that up. So, the person who brings it up in a way that is more likely to be listened to, is more likely to be successful at getting their ideas heard, which is the point. Um, but the person who uh, brings up brings it up in the most confrontational way possible may feel like they're being very courageous, but they might just be being kind of a jerk. So
Yeah.
that's also a concern that you can have. It's, basically thinking things through, and thinking through both the risk and the benefit and how you're going to get there.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying, which is, really important, is
Mhm,
this is really about the approach to the risk and how can you
mhm,
minimize the risk
mhm,
through,
mhm.
every situation in which courage is necessary. So how
Yeah.
can you
eh,
minimize the risk? How can you think
Yeah.
it through to really, take
Right.
some of the irrational fear out
Right.
of it and
Right.
yeah,
And
minimize
I'm
it.
not, and I don't know to what extent, and we certainly don't have the research on this to show to what extent this can be translated or generalized from situation to situation to situation. So we don't really have that kind of technology. There's been just a couple research projects out there so far on ways that people increase their courage.
Hmm.
One of them asked people to and both of them, I should add, were in the context of psychotherapy for
Okay.
people who were afraid of some particular thing at an irrational level.
Okay.
So, if you are afraid of spiders, for example, research by Peter Norton and one of his students shows that if you pay people to get closer to the spider, courage doesn't matter for how close they get to the spider. Everybody is willing to get closer. So, like, everybody ends up looking more courageous. um, Research from Amanda Kramer and Rick Zimbarg shows that if you ask people who are afraid of giving a speech if they would think about a time that they successfully overcame a similar kind of situation. So they think back to a time where they were successful at this,
Yes.
whatever this happens to be, then they are more they look more courageous in preparing for that. Um,
That's like building up your confidence when you can remember your past
yeah,
successes.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly, exactly. But I'm not sure how well I don't know the answer to this, and I don't think anybody does. I
Yeah.
don't know how well, like, paying people to do a particular thing in general would help. And I don't know how much um, reflecting back on a time that you successfully dealt with a thing that you were afraid of would help.
Yeah.
And I think this is particularly true when you think about situations in which there actually is a real risk. So the person wanting to speak up at the meeting, if the real risk is getting fired, that is again, like I said, very different than just an irrational fear of like, if I say anything, people will look at me and notice me. Um,
Right.
those
Yeah,
are
it
very
might take some
different.
more thought. The process to get there to
Yeah.
speak up might be longer because, weighing the risk
Yeah.
takes
Yeah.
a little bit
And the courage research that's been done in the context of psychotherapy, it all, and that's where Jack Rackman came from too, with his
longer.
idea of acting without fear, despite feeling fear. In psychotherapy, almost all the times that we're talking about things like this, we're really usually talking about people who are trying to get over some sort of excessive fear that they have or an excessive judgment of riskiness that they have.
Okay.
And a lot of the times they even recognize it themselves and it's a goal of the therapy. And so getting over the fear is always a good thing. So that's actually been one of the things that's kind of been irking me lately when reading in
Yeah.
the media about, don't live in fear of the coronavirus. It's like, I'm not living in fear of the coronavirus. I'm taking sensible public health measures. And those are different. Um,
Correct. I want to go back to one thing that you said about excessive fear and
mhm,
the studies that were done and helping people get over their excessive fears. How
mhm.
do you know, at what point do you know that a fear is excessive?
Uh, yeah, that's a super, super good question. The DSM defines it as it's something that is either harmless or blown way out of proportion, or and it's a judgment call of
Right.
how excessive it is. So dogs actually do kill a number of people every year, but most dog encounters are completely harmless. And in fact, lots of people love dogs. And so fear of dogs could be excessive if you're afraid of a kind of harmless dog, or it could be quite reasonable if there are a pack of wild feral dogs bearing down on you. That's actually kind of dangerous, and running
Yeah.
away from those dogs is probably a good thing. Or at least figuring out a way. I don't know enough about dogs to, maybe you shouldn't run, maybe that makes them attack more, I don't know, but
Right.
like being afraid in that situation actually could help you, um, and could guide your responses in an appropriate way. um, the DSM also defines phobic fears as being those that limit the person in some way, or that the person is excessively bothered by. And
Okay.
so, by um, within these situations, you're already, it kind of has built right into it that if you're letting it get in the way of something that you want to do, that's the problem.
That might, okay. And what is DSM? I don't know what that is.
Oh my gosh, that is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. I told you I
Okay.
was trained as a clinician. That's the main psychiatric Bible in the
Got
U.S.
it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm
So
so sorry.
no, it's okay. I think there's a desire to want to simplify this and say, if you
Mhm,
want to act courageously, if you want to, build up your ability to
mhm,
conjure courage,
mhm.
do these things.
Yeah,
And what I'm hearing you say is it really is different from situation to situation,
yeah,
goal to goal.
yeah. I
Um,
I really, I suspect that it is. I maybe a guess, and oh my gosh, this is just a guess, not backed by research at all. Um, but the more confidence that you have in your decision making ability, and the more confidence you have that you are good at picking good goals and prioritizing and realizing, like, oh, this is an important thing, this is not an important thing. So you can kind of figure out the difference between the big stuff and the small stuff
yeah,
in your life, and don't sweat the small stuff, but be concerned about the big stuff. And it's which is pretty good advice that has gone back for as long as I think people have probably been giving advice.
yeah.
um
So
Pick your battles.
a focus on confidence,
Hmm.
is going to be useful and courage no
Yeah.
matter what you're trying to do.
Hmm.
Um, evaluating the risk and really kind of seeing how big it is. Are you going to get
Hmm.
fired or are you just going to
Hmm.
feel icky?
Right,
Um,
right.
and then I think I've also read too, and it might have been in the psychology of courage, that
Hmm.
competence is also important. So your skill level. Maybe
Yeah.
you're not afraid to speak in public because you have built up this
Yes.
competency to where you can
Mhm,
do it whenever,
mhm.
wherever.
And
Um,
yes, and those can be
yeah.
internal things to the person, and they can also be external things. So I had a student several years ago who was also a police officer,
Hmm.
and it was really interesting because he was like, well, it would be, if there was a shooter in the building, it would be much more courageous for you to go try to tackle him than me, because I'm trained and I've got, my sidearm. So, and that completely makes a lot of sense,
Yeah.
and so it's both internal stuff to him, and that's his job, but also external stuff, like he's got all that equipment. So running into a burning building is sort of to save another person is kind of, I think the action that I pull on most often as the uber example of courage, that like
Yeah.
everybody will agree that this is courageous.
Yeah.
um, but for a firefighter to run into a burning building to save someone, the firefighter has training, but they also have a lot of protective equipment that we don't have, as non-firefighters. So those are
So
different
then
sorts of situations.
does the onlooker get to decide what is courageous?
Everybody does. I mean,
Yeah.
realistically, I think everybody does. So we
Everybody does.
we make a
Yeah.
distinction between courage as a process, and that's kind of a lot of what we've been talking about so
Yeah.
far, is how do you go about taking a courageous action? How does someone go ahead and decide that this thing that feels risky to me is worth doing?
Mhm.
Um, that's different than what we call accolade courage, or saying something is courageous. And accolade courage can come into play not only with onlookers, but also with people after the fact, including the person who took the action.
Mm.
And some of the things that play into whether or not you say someone's action is courageous or not is, do you agree that whatever they did is risky?
Okay.
And every single and also, do you agree with the goals that they were pursuing? Every single student I've had on my CI team, and a lot of other people I've talked to about this research, will hear about a particular thing and they'll think, that's not courageous.
Mm.
So there's an item on a courage scale that I have out there with Cooper Woodard, that says if I would ask for a raise if I really needed one. And at a conference, I actually had this guy like mock that at a presentation, because he's like, that's not courageous. That's just, being good at your job or something. And I was like, oh yeah, I tried to explain it, but I don't think he got it. But
Yeah.
it's, for some people that is courageous. Uh, but he obviously wasn't seeing that as being a thing. And I've noticed that clinicians are very quick to say that people doing things to get over fears, or, oh my gosh, he did that despite having horrible flashbacks from combat related PTSD. That's really brave.
Mhm.
They're real quick to see that because that's what they deal with every day. People outside of clinical world aren't always as quick to see that.
Mhm.
Um, People also differ in terms of how worthwhile they see the goal that the person is pursuing. So I had a participant in one of my studies talk about how she was an older woman, and she talked about a thing that she did that was courageous, is that after she had her first child, her doctor told her that if she had another one, it could kill her, but she really wanted another child, so she had one anyways. And I read that as a mother, and I'm just like, oh wow. And I was talking to a physician of mine, and he asked me about my research, and so I shared this with him, and he was like, that's not courageous, that's just stupid.
Oh, wow.
And
Yeah.
because his perspective was, we don't say that to people unless we really mean it, and like, she
Yeah.
totally could have died, and then that little kid wouldn't have had a mother. And he went on and on and on. I was like, that's really interesting. That's an
Yeah.
interesting perspective. And you can kind of do little thought experiments to think about, if people had been, we can imagine 3 people in a burn unit who've been equally burned in a fire and are
Mhm.
equally likely to die. They've all run into a house fire. One of them ran in to save a baby. That person is going to be hailed as a hero and is super courageous. The second person ran into the fire to take a selfie surrounded by flames because they're an idiot. That
Right.
person's probably just going to get a psych consultation because that is a very stupid thing to do. The third person ran into the building to save a pet. Is that courageous or not? It's going to depend on how you feel about pets.
Yeah.
And it might change. Is it a pet cat or a pet dog, or is it a pet rat? What if it's your pet snake? And I even feel myself changing how I feel about
How
that
you
as
feel.
I'm
Yeah. Me
speaking.
too. Snake,
Even,
no.
yeah, exactly. It's just a reptile. I mean, I don't think snakes are icky, but it's just a reptile, or my pet cockroach, or my pet ant colony, and it depends. And there are people out there who love their pet cockroaches and love their pet snakes and would absolutely do that. And so
Yeah.
and then there are non-pet people who are just like, it's a dog. Why would you do that it's just a dog. It's not worth it. And so that shift is an interesting kind of one. And we see it at an incredibly high level within politics. And if you read about any political anything, you'll see people being praised as being courageous for things you just think that's the opposite of what you should do. And people who are on your side about whatever the thing is are like, yeah, those people are cowards for blah blah. And it'll be the same action even. And so
Yeah.
it's very loaded, and I think that's, to me, what really heightens the importance of figuring out what that particular goal is. It's also possible for people to be doing something that's kind of courageous in a sense just for them, and maybe they don't deserve any kind of award for it, but it's pretty neat. But they may not see it that way. We've called that personal courage, and that's
Right.
when you do something that's courageous just for you. So if you really do have a lot of social anxiety, and just being willing to say something at a meeting and take responsibility for it verbally in front of other people may be a big deal. And you should feel courageous for doing that because you stood up to this thing you were afraid of that you saw as risky for something you thought was worthwhile. And that is completely appropriate. You probably won't get a medal for it, but that's completely appropriate to feel that way. The other thing that we found is that people discount the courage of unsuccessful actions. So,
Ah, yeah, let's talk about this.
yeah.
If
So
something doesn't end up the way you want
if
it
it
to.
doesn't end up the way you were hoping it would, you're less likely to nominate it as something that you've done that was courageous, but you're also less likely to see it that way in other people. So Autumn Hensel and I gave people scenarios and said, how courageous was this? And the only thing that was different about the scenarios is some of them succeeded and some of them failed. And we even made sure that a lot of the ones that failed were things that failed not due to the person's fault at all.
Okay.
So the someone they're standing up against some bullies for another person, but the bullies don't listen because they're just jerks. That's seen as less courageous than if the bullies back down,
Wow.
even if the action is described in exactly the same way. And you can kind of think back in your own life about that. If you moved across the country for a job opportunity and then the company went under, you're not likely to think, I was very courageous to move all across the country all by myself for this unknown thing that then 6 months later I had to look for another job, even though you didn't know that at the time. And it was exactly, it was exactly the same thing had it turned out differently, you know, and in
Yeah.
that scenario, the company could have failed due to nothing that you could have had any control over, like another division
Mhm.
sunk them, and you had no control over that.
So that almost makes me wonder because I feel like courage begets more courage. Like if you
Hmm.
can remember times like we talked about
Hmm.
before that you successfully
Yes.
done something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if it's unsuccessful, it could still be
Mhm.
courage, but if it's unsuccessful, you're likely maybe not to call it courage or even
Yeah,
remember.
you're likely not to think of it that way. And this is a
Yeah.
tricky thing, and I don't know what the right answer is to that because um it's great if you can look back on things that you did that were courageous and feel like, yes, that was courageous. That was really cool. But it's also painful to look back on things that you failed at and or that have failed despite your best efforts. And that's not necessarily going to be the most confidence boosting thing that you can think of.
Right.
So I'm not actually sure what the right answer is, except it's worth respecting what people want in that situation, even if that person is you. So
Yeah.
so there was a gentleman who lived near me, man, about probably about 5, 10 years ago now. And he was in the newspaper for, I didn't know him, but he was in the newspaper for having run into a building, literally run into a burning building to save 2 people.
Hmm.
And super courageous. He ran in, he saved the elderly husband, and then he ran in and saved the elderly wife, or vice versa, dragged them out. Both of them died of smoke inhalation very shortly afterwards, and he didn't want to talk to anybody about it. Had they lived, we would have seen him all over the news, and I bet he would have been, super proud and excited and welcomed into that family.
Wow.
um, and and it was not his fault. He went as fast as he could. um,
That's
and it's
interesting.
just
Wow.
kind of how things go. And the same thing seems to be true when we self-nominate our own courageous actions. That's the biggest effect I've ever found in any of my own research. People will say, like, the mode is like a 10 out of 10 for saying I made the situation better, and like a 1 or 2 for saying I made the situation worse. Um,
That
when
is
you
so
just
fascinating to
think
me.
about that.
I'm going to
Yeah,
think more
yeah,
about that because I think
yeah,
I think that's so fascinating. Um,
yeah.
this has been so good for me. I love courage. I'm devoted to it. You know so much about
Good.
it. Um, but I do want to ask you
Yeah,
because I'll go around and I'll speak to people and I'll ask them the question, what do you want the courage to do? Or
yeah,
um,
that's a good one.
I'll phrase it mostly like that. What do you want the
Hmm.
courage to do? And what
Hmm.
I've encountered, Dr. Puri, is that
Yeah,
most people do not know.
yeah.
So even though we move through life and we have these goals and we want to be able to speak up in
Mhm,
meetings, we want to
mhm,
be able
mhm,
to move across the country for another job
mhm,
or whatever,
mhm.
for whatever reason, when I ask that question,
Mhm.
people cannot come up with an answer. And do you
Huh.
think that's because courage is not as, kind of talked about as maybe bravery or fearlessness, or do you think people just don't think about it?
I'm guessing more like people don't really think about it, or it sort of depends. So I bet they would have an answer if you knew enough about their life to say, wow, would you like to be able to ask that person out? Or would you like to be able to get that promotion at work? Or even would you like to not stop feeling so self-conscious when you speak up? Um, and so and those are 3 very different goals,
Yeah.
right? Those are
And they're
3.
specific. They're
Yeah, they're very
specific. Yeah.
specific. And the more I've looked at courage, the more it seems to be a somewhat more specific, less general kind of thing. Does that mean that there's not individual differences in how willing people are to stand up to their own fear? No, because there are individual differences in that. But I don't there's so much more to it that I can easily see that being overwhelmed by all these situational things, like what is the particular risk and what is the particular goal that you're trying to do, and what particular skills do you have that you can say, oh, I can do this and this and this to get to that.
Yeah. I love that. And I think that just kind of made it more clear for me is
Mhm.
courage is specific. It's
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
I think I've been approaching it in some ways as
Hmm.
general, like what do you want the
Hmm.
courage to
Hmm.
do? And
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
imagining or expecting people to just come up with something. But
yeah, yeah,
when you ask the specific questions like you just did,
yeah.
yeah, that makes all the difference.
Yeah,
Okay, that's helpful.
yeah, I think you could probably ask them, what things in your life would you like to be able to accomplish that you're not accomplishing right now? Are there risks in your pathways to get to those things? What would you like, would you like to be able to do them or not? And there are risks that aren't worth taking. I mean, and
Yeah.
that's the other thing too,
Ooh,
is there
great
there are
point.
there are definitely risks that are not worth taking. As it's not worth risking your life or the life of others just to go to a party, but people are doing that now and it just drives me nuts. And they portray it as courageous. And I'm like,
Mm,
I just don't see that. And maybe I undervalue parties, I don't know, but I don't see that. And then there's also courage itself is about risks for yourself,
mhm,
not putting risks on other people. Putting risks on other people is like being a rear line general and sending other people into harm's way.
mm,
And so it's is it courageous for a leader to risk the careers of their followers
mm.
by doing something? I don't I don't know, but I feel much less confident and much less comfortable about that. Um, is it courageous to stand up to fear or risk to do something that objectively is bad? There have been several different people who have interviewed terrorists, and we've
Mm,
looked at suicide notes and spree killer manifestos, and they sound like they think they're being courageous by
yeah,
doing those horrible things. And no, those are
yeah.
awful goals that should not be pursued. And again, and this is a more minor, a more major version, I should say, of the more minor, like political calling someone a courageous or calling them a coward.
Mhm.
Um, and
And so does that go back
depends.
to because I don't know if it was in your book or if I read an article. So there was debate over
Uh-huh.
whether 9/11 was courageous if the people who
Oh yeah, that's Yeah, that was Bill Maher, who
okay.
lost his TV show for saying that, call it what you want, but it was not cowardly.
Yeah,
And
and so does
yeah,
that go
yeah,
back to it goes back to the worthy goal. It goes back to
yeah, yeah,
you reinterpret that action as
yeah.
worthy.
And
Yeah.
sometimes it can be the absolute opposite of worthy. It can be a despicable goal.
Yeah.
So those are similar things, and then it depends on what goal is being pursued, and that's definitely been one thing that I've always wanted to caution people about with increasing courage is like make sure it's not something bad. Please
Yeah.
make sure it's not something bad. Please make sure this is indeed the thing that you want to be pursuing, and if you're an outside person trying to help someone else, please make sure that they have goals that you think are worthy of being pursued and are good for society.
Yeah. Is
So
there
it's
any part of
complicated.
your research that has left a hole for you and you're like, when the next research study or
Oh,
experiment that I do, I want to zero in on this particular thing. Is
oh,
there
it's
anything out
it's
there?
so it's so funny that you say that because I'm actually pre-pandemic. I was supposed to be on sabbatical this year doing those things.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but now I'm not. I'm at my house teaching classes remotely, and teaching more. So there's that.
Yeah.
Uh, but the some next steps are what can we do to increase courage? Because that's the question that we get all the time. And there's just these two studies out there, and the two studies are in the context of clinical psych. And so I've got some ideas about that, but I don't want to say too much about it because,
Yeah.
we don't have any data on it really. We have a little bit of data. I have a little bit of ideas that it'll be, like focusing on how good your goal is, how worthwhile your goal is going to be probably your best bet.
Mhm.
Unless your attention is so attracted, so stuck on the risk that you need to do something about it, or if it's a legitimate, like silly risk that you can reduce, like you can reduce it by using proper safety equipment, or you can reduce it by not phrasing that meeting comment in the most confrontational, obnoxious way. Those are definitely things that you can do.
Absolutely. Oh, I can't wait until that research comes out because that is the
Yeah,
question that
yeah,
people
it really
want
is.
answer to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it really is. It really is. And I've got I'm working with some undergraduate students right now, and we are working on a follow-up study to some preliminary data that we've had for I've had for decades, And I've got a couple other ideas that we're kind of backburnered by the pandemic, but
Yeah.
we're going to get to them.
I hope, are you going to get to take sabbatical next year
It
or?
depends on when. I got a little note from the provost saying, next time sabbaticals are offered, you're first in line. So
Okay. Got it.
it'll be when it is, and
Yeah.
it'll just be when it is, and
Yeah.
otherwise I'll fit it in and it'll be fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me and talking to me about courage and offering so
You're very
much
welcome.
insight. I really, really appreciate it.
You're
And
very welcome. It was a very
yeah,
interesting conversation. You're very well prepared. So
thank you.
I
I'm
enjoyed
going to,
being interviewed by you.
awesome. Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome.